I'll be blunt. Europa Universalis 5 does not forgive autopilot. If you go in thinking you can just expand, grab a strong alliance, and wait for time to pass, the game will punish you with a crooked economy, diplomacy betraying you at the worst possible timing, and wars that look easy until they turn into a disaster. So, in today's video, I've put together 10 advanced tips you need to know. This isn't tutorial stuff. It's the kind of detail that takes your campaign from I'm surviving to I'm controlling the board. These are things I wish I had understood early on because they save decades, prevent silent mistakes, and transform small decisions into an absurd advantage down the line. When I started paying real attention to crown power in EU5, I realized it wasn't just another meter to fill with occasional decisions. It's the kind of resource that changes the way you play because it drives the engine of your economy and your government at the same time. The trick to the crown power loop is precisely treating it as a continuous investment, not a situational bonus. To me, the most important part of this tip is that healthy obsession with average province control. Instead of just chasing expansion or hitting the tax button when the treasury gets tight, you start thinking, how do I make this territory behave like part of a real state? Roads, ports, temples, and even stationed armies stop being costs to look at later and become pieces of your long-term plan because they increase control and stabilize the base that feeds crown power. What I find most elegant about this is that crown power becomes an automatic reward for good administration. You aren't farming a resource artificially, you are reaping the result of making your provinces more governable and predictable. And that predictability in a grand strategy game is worth gold. Fewer fiscal surprises, fewer efficiency holes, and less feeling like you're always putting out fires with money that doesn't exist. In my playstyle, I like to use this mindset as a simple rule. Before conquering more, I try to make what's already mine perform as if it's truly mine. If I feel my average control is sagging, I slow down expansion and become the empire's mayor for a while. And almost always, this returns in the form of an economy that scales better, more political stability, and an incredible second wind for future wars. This tip is the kind of thing that separates a kingdom that survives from a state that dominates. When I realized you could fix bad starting laws using the parliament in EU5, my whole perspective on starting a campaign changed. You know that feeling of looking at a law that stalls your centralization, efficiency, or government pace and thinking, okay, I'm going to have to swallow this for decades. Well, not necessarily. The parliament becomes a much smarter escape valve than trying to change everything by force. The aha moment, the way I like to see it, is treating the debate as a calculated test. You call the parliament, work to get over 50% support, and ask for the law change. If it works, great. You corrected your course early without bleeding out your entire country. If it fails, you still paid a relatively manageable price, and that's what makes this tip strong. Failing costs only -7 stability, which is often less traumatic than the penalties and roadblocks of a poorly timed manual change. What's most interesting is that this messes with your reform timing. Instead of waiting for the perfect window, with high stability, surplus economy, and zero internal risk, you accept that the game is about pushing small advantages that turn into an avalanche later. I've had campaigns where a bad law at the start seemed minor, but it slowly eroded my ability to govern expansion, manage estates, and keep the country running smoothly. Solving this early via parliament gave me the sense of actually piloting the country, rather than just reacting to the setup it rolled with. Now, there is a very human detail to this. -7 stability is scary, but in practice, I'd rather deal with a large, one-time drop than a constant bleed of efficiency for decades. Stability you can rebuild. Time lost to a locked government structure never comes back. And if you prepare for that hit, holding off on events, avoiding unnecessary wars, building a resource cushion, the drop becomes more of a bump than a disaster. I like this tip because it rewards courage with planning. You use Parliament as a real political tool. You try to gather support, make the change through the institutional path, and even when it doesn't pass, you pay a bill that's usually cheaper than forcing it through the menu. It's the kind of play that, when it works, accelerates your country early and leaves the rest of the campaign with that delicious feeling that everything is yielding better than it should. Using minting to generate inflation on purpose is the kind of move that looks like madness at first glance, but in EU5, it has its moment. I remember the first time I did it. I was buried in debt, interest eating half my monthly income, and every economic event seemed to sink me deeper. Then it clicked. What if, instead of trying to save pennies, I just print enough money to kill the whole debt at once? It sounds irresponsible, and it is, but sometimes it's the masterstroke that saves a campaign. The point is understanding that this trick isn't about gaining money, but buying time. When you use minting to generate extra gold and silver, you get an immediate injection of liquidity. This allows you to pay off large loans before the interest snowball becomes an avalanche. It's like ripping off a band-aid. It hurts, but you solve it fast. And the curious part is that this pain comes in the form of inflation, which will stay with you for a long time. In my experience, the secret lies in treating inflation as a controlled tool, not an inevitable punishment. I mentally set a limit. Something around 10% inflation is still manageable if the economy has a solid base. Beyond that, it starts eroding your fiscal and trade efficiency to the point of putting you in a vicious cycle. So the ideal is to mint with an exit plan, stabilize the economy, pay off the debts, and immediately invest in policies, advisors, or decisions that gradually reduce inflation. When used well, minting can actually save your country from total bankruptcy. It's like using adrenaline on a patient on the verge of cardiac arrest. You give that shock, stabilize the body, and then comes the long recovery phase. I've had campaigns where the minting trick was the turning point, a desperate act that bought me time to rebuild trade, increase tax efficiency, and breathe again without depending on foreign banks. But remember, if you get used to this tactic, it will destroy you. It's too easy to see the minting button as a quick fix, and by the time you realize it, your currency is worth less than scrap paper. The charm of this tip is the balance, using the crisis in your favor, but with the awareness that the game's economy is a living beast. You can tame it for a while, but if you abuse it, it will bite back. This tip about naval patrols is one of those that seems like a UI detail, but ends up becoming a game changer when you play as a maritime nation. I remember discovering this almost by accident, poking around the fleet panel and seeing that half-forgotten patrol icon. I activated it out of curiosity and suddenly realized my coastal control, trade, and even colony stability started responding differently. It was the moment I understood that keeping a navy idle is an absurd waste of potential. For me, the most interesting part is how the game treats maritime presence as an extension of administrative power. Each patrolling fleet creates an invisible zone of influence on the map, which helps reduce proximity penalties and increase global control. It's almost as if the sea stops being just a means of transport and becomes an active part of your country's political structure. When you activate patrols, you are literally governing through the seas, something few grand strategy games represent this well. And yes, galleys are the stars of this in the early game. They have a low cost, high maneuverability, and that natural control bonus that makes all the difference in the early stages. I like to use them in groups, spreading small fleets across strategic seas. No idle superships in port waiting for a war event. By performing constant patrols, you maintain presence, deter piracy, improve trade, and help your routes yield more continuously. One thing I've learned over time is that these patrols also have a subtle effect on the Empire's sense of security. Even without visually seeing the range of this presence, you feel the country breathing easier. Less vulnerable ports, less chance of surprises, and an economic base that grows at a steady pace. When maritime control clicks, it provides that kind of invisible stability that makes all the difference later on when the real war starts. In the end, that's the beauty of the tip. understanding that control isn't just conquered with troops or decrees. The sea is also territory. Activating patrols is like placing eyes and flags on the waves, a reminder that the sea can be both a wall and a bridge. And for those playing maritime nations, it's the mechanic that transforms a luxury navy into a functional one that actually works to make the state grow. This tip about passive momentum in social values is one of those things you only understand the real weight of after a few campaigns. At first, I saw these social values almost as window dressing, symbolic, nice on paper, but without immediate practical impact. Then I discovered positive momentum, that plus 0.01 or more that makes the value rise on its own over time. And it was like finding a secret system working for you behind the scenes. Suddenly, you realize you are molding your country's national spirit without needing to micromanage every decision. What really got me was understanding that this passive growth is cumulative and permanent. No decay, no artificial ceiling. This means that if you plant the seeds well, using parliament and a few choice events, you can turn a social value into a powerful driving force. For example, if you want a more rationalist or egalitarian nation, just ensure the momentum stays positive and the game does the work. It's a reward for consistency and long-term vision, something rare in a game so systemic and punitive. I really like the part about parliamentary concessions because they are the fuel for this engine. Often, you don't need to push the social value with radical measures. Just keep the parliament fed and stabilize majority support. This creates the ideal scenario for momentum to act naturally. The beauty of it is that it's not a sudden plus 10 from a miracle event, but a smooth, almost organic growth that changes the country's behavior bit by bit. It's long-term politics in the most literal sense. And the golden point of the tip, targeting events after 50%, is where the magic happens. When a social value passes the halfway mark, the game starts triggering events that further reinforce the identity you've built. It's the moment the loop closes. What started as a small numerical bonus becomes a cultural and political avalanche. I've had campaigns where this mechanism completely redefined my country's destiny, and it all started with that tiny plus 0.01 that seemed irrelevant. Ultimately, this tip summarizes the philosophy EU5 encourages. Stop trying to fix everything with immediate decrees and learn to direct subtle forces that grow on their own over time. Passive momentum is exactly that. A reminder that not all power comes from quick clicks or military conquests. Sometimes, the most lasting strength of your empire is the one you simply kept alive, feeding it bit by bit until it became tradition. When I started conquering larger countries, I fell into that classic trap of, since I won, I'll force vassalization and that's it. In practice, however, this almost always gave me a resentful vassal, eager to sabotage me at the first opportunity, and I'd spend the next few years putting out political fires. Then I tested this tip of releasing the nation as a vassal within the peace deal itself, and the difference in diplomatic climate is absurd. The reason is simple. When you release the country as a vassal instead of imposing vassalization by force, they tend to start with opinion through the roof, almost at the maximum. This changes everything because high opinion generally means less immediate friction, less chance of revolts due to indirect instability, easier management to keep them in line, and a much smoother path to building trust. Instead of being the occupier, you become the convenient protector, and the game rewards that narrative. For me, the best use of this is transforming a difficult conquest into a long-term asset. You trade the instant satisfaction of annexing or humiliating for a vassal that is born cooperative, ready to help in war, hold borders, and even serve as a buffer against rivals. And then comes the delightful part. You can feed this vassal's surrounding territories, especially if they have useful cores or claims, without having to deal directly with all the administrative and control problems for every newly taken province. Another thing I like about this approach is how it reduces the drama of integration later. A vassal that loves you tends to be much less work to keep loyal, which means less spending on emergency placating, fewer desperate measures to hold stability, and more room for you to plan. I feel this makes the game more strategic and less reactive. You choose the moment to integrate when you are ready, not when the vassal forces you to resolve a crisis. Of course, it's not magic. You still need to keep an eye on relative power, external alliances, and the risk of growing the vassal too large. But on balance, releasing as a vassal in the peace deal is one of those moves that seems kind while being coldly efficient. When it works, you conquer a country and gain a loyal partner from day one, and that, to me, is worth more than any quick victory. This tip about preserving strong rural RGOs, raw goods operations, is something I learned the hard way, by messing up. I'd see a place with food, wood, or stone yielding well and think, perfect, I'll urbanize here to gain control and fill it with population. Result? I killed the goose that laid the golden eggs and didn't even realize it at the time, because in the short term, the city looks like an upgrade. But when production drops by half, the hole appears later, and by then, it's too late. What changes your mindset is understanding that a strong rural RGO isn't just income, it's a logistical foundation. Food sustains population and armies. Wood and stone sustain construction, maintenance, and expansion. When you convert that into a city/town, you trade a stable, productive base for a structure that depends on those very supplies to avoid a crisis. It's one of those cases where the game lets you press the button, but charges you with interest down the road. I like to think of it this way. A city isn't for improving a good province. A city is for fixing a bottleneck. If I need pop capacity, centralized administration, or increased control in a strategic area, then urbanization makes sense. But if the place is a granary, a productive forest, or an extraction hub that keeps my country supplied, I treat it as sacred ground. I prefer to build around it, improve infrastructure, and protect that production rather than turning it into a skyline and regretting it later. The scariest part of this tip is the domino effect. You touch one point, and suddenly your food supplies plummet, the population starts to suffer, and the country enters a kind of silent crisis. It's not an immediate defeat in battle, it's a decay. You start seeing internal pressures, falling growth, price and availability issues, and your strong empire becomes a body that can't feed itself. This is very realistic and, at the same time, very cruel if you aren't paying attention. Today, when I look at the map, I mentally mark which provinces are the rural heart and which are the urban cores of my state. I let the high production RGOs do their job and use cities where they truly shine: concentration, control, and population. It feels counterintuitive at first because urbanizing gives that sense of progress, but this tip taught me that in EU5, progress without supply is just a well-dressed collapse. This tip about placing a member of the ruler's dynasty in the cabinet is the kind of insight that changes how you view internal politics in the game. At first, I focused too much on numbers, efficiency bonuses, cost-benefit of administrative decisions, and completely forgot to look at the dynasty as a system that generates real influence. When I realized that having someone of my lineage in the cabinet was enough to give a direct boost to provincial control, it was like discovering a social shortcut hidden in the bureaucracy. The feeling is almost narrative. You are strengthening the sense of your government's presence. A member of the dynasty in the cabinet represents continuity, legitimacy, and authority, and the game translates this mechanically by improving control in the provinces. It makes total sense, right? When the people see the royal family or the ruling clan directly participating in decisions, the structure aligns. And in practice, this reduces some of those administrative micro-pressures that stall the country when control starts to drop. But the detail that struck me most was the warning about unhappy estates. Because yes, if you ignore power groups and form a purely technical cabinet, they won't just sit still. They start acting against you. And the game models this brilliantly. Disgruntled estates literally build infrastructure against you, creating subtle political and economic hurdles. It's a mini passive revolution happening behind the scenes while you think everything is fine. It was a reality check in my first long campaign. What I learned is that governing in EU5 is much more about strategic representation than maximizing raw efficiency. Assembling the right cabinet is an art of balance. Bringing in people who strengthen the king, but also keeping the estates engaged enough so they don't become obstacles. And including a dynasty member is the symbolic gesture that ties it all together, as if to say, the throne is still in charge, but it hears its people. Today, when I set up my cabinet, I always look at the dynasty first. Even if the bonus seems small on paper, the long-term impact on control and internal stability is massive. This tip made me see the game with a more human layer, because deep down, Europa Universalis is exactly that, a simulator of how power, influence, and legitimacy interact. And when your own family holds the cards, the whole country feels the weight of that presence. It took me a while to accept that an army without artillery is like showing up to a modern war with courage but few tools. In the beginning, I built stacks of infantry, thinking melee solves it, and it did, but at the cost of bleeding manpower and turning every fortress into a soap opera. When I started fitting real artillery into my compositions, the campaign's pace changed, less silly attrition and more decisive victories. The bombardment phase is where this tip shines. When you dominate this stage, you reduce that stupid damage that usually hits the infantry even before the real battle happens. You not only preserve your lines, but keep your units ready to fight again immediately afterward. And this has a psychological effect on the map. You start advancing with confidence because your army stops falling apart after every skirmish. In sieges, the difference is almost cruel. Artillery transforms fortresses into temporary obstacles, not eternal walls. With a high initiative general, you accelerate the process and gain that campaign momentum where the enemy can't regroup, can't breathe, and you're already pushing to the next defensive position. I like this feeling because it feels like you're winning the war on logistics and time, not just numbers. Then comes what I consider the full package: artillery to break, infantry to hold, and cavalry to punish when the gap opens. Cavalry provides that extra damage at the right moment, especially when the enemy is already disorganized or trying to retreat, and this shortens entire wars. The catch is that many people build the perfect composition on paper, but forget that the game charges you when you overdo it and can't sustain the army in the field. That's why I always hammer home. Food lines and supplies aren't a boring detail. They're what separates a brilliant offensive from a funeral march. A long campaign without food turns into hunger, attrition, plummeting morale, and expensive artillery becoming dead weight. When I plan in advance, I think first about the supply path, and only then about the target, because the fastest siege in the world is worth nothing if your army starts dying before it even reaches the fortress. Bankruptcy in Europa Universalis 5 is one of those words I treat almost like a curse. It's not, oh, I'll just declare bankruptcy and come back later, because the game transforms it into a long, recurring punishment that haunts you month after month for years, and even blocks constructions, meaning you lose the very tool that would get you out of the hole. The first time I came close, I understood that it's not just a financial reset, it's a strangulation of your future. The mistake that most often leads to this spiral, in my experience, is the trickle of small loans. You take one, then another, then one more, and before you know it, you are paying interest to support the habit of paying interest. It's a feeling of constantly patching the ship's hull while it keeps taking on water. And worse, since they are smaller loans, you tend to use that money on current expenses and emergencies, not on things that actually increase your income generating capacity. That's why I like the logic of taking giant loans all at once, but with a clear purpose: infrastructure that changes your level, roads to raise control and reduce logistical attrition, investment in RGOs to increase production and stabilize supplies, ports and economic hubs that improve trade flow, things that generate continuous returns. When you take a large loan and throw it into projects that pay for themselves over time, you create a real path out, instead of just buying a few more months of survival. At the same time, it's no use increasing future revenue if you keep burning money in the present. I always make that ruthless cut to maintenance when I'm at peace. Leaving armies at 50 to 75% is the kind of adjustment that doesn't look glamorous, but saves campaigns. You reduce expenses immediately, maintain a minimum security force, and gain the breathing room to cross the critical period until the economy starts responding to investments. Ultimately, the philosophy of this tip is simple. Debt is only worth it when it buys power, not when it buys relief. I treat the treasury like a war plan. If I'm going into the red, I want it to be for a reason that puts me on a higher step afterward. Because in EU5, bankruptcy isn't a stumble, it's a fall down the stairs. And avoiding that fall almost always depends on one brave, concentrated decision instead of a bunch of small, desperate ones.